Welcome to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast, where we talk with the nation's top experts about today's toughest parenting challenges. Whether you're concerned about your child's development, learning, behavior, or you just want to make family time more enjoyable, we share the practical solutions and tools that can help.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to an all-new episode of the Exceptional Parenting Podcast, brought to you by Torchlight. I'm your host, Stefanie Boucher, and today we are going to be talking about mental health, and in particular, the current level of well-being, or maybe the lack thereof, of our children, teens, and young adults. 2020 has been an incredibly tough year, one that has undoubtedly burdened the hearts, minds, and bodies of, well, just about all of us, really, including, and in some ways especially, our young people who have lost so much and whose lives have been turned upside down by ongoing school closures and social isolation and social unrest. It's been very difficult. And what's interesting is that we are layering these newer stressors on top of a mental health crisis in this country that was already precarious to begin with. As any child health expert can tell you, anxiety and depression were very much on the rise before 2020 began, and now the challenges are even greater. To provide a bit more perspective around these issues, I have some interesting numbers that were put out by the Centers for Disease Control in August. This was a wide-scale national study across various age groups that looked at the health of Americans during the pandemic. And it's rather grim. 41% of respondents reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition at the time of the survey. This includes symptoms of anxiety disorder or depressive disorder. Symptoms of trauma and stressor-related disorder were also on the rise. About 26% of respondents said they were experiencing symptoms of trauma. 13% or more had either started or increased their level of substance use to cope with stress or emotions related to COVID-19. And perhaps most frightening of all, the percentage of respondents who reported having seriously considered suicide in the 30 days before completing the survey was 10%, but significantly higher among respondents aged 18 to 24 years. That was over 25%. So really, really concerning stuff. This feels like a crisis to me. So we're going to spend this episode talking about how our teens and our young adult children are doing during this ongoing pandemic and otherwise. We're going to talk about anxiety and depression and trauma because, spoiler alert here, trauma can encompass a lot more than one might think. And then we're going to offer you as parents some tips on supporting your child through difficult times. I have Sal Caraviello on the line with me today. Sal has been working with adolescents for more than 30 years. As a former teacher, administrator, coach, counselor, and youth minister, he has developed really unique insight into the concerns of today's youth, and he's worked tirelessly to help countless children and families find balance in various areas of their lives. Welcome, Sal. Really lucky to have you, as always. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, first, Stefanie, thank you. I am honored to be here. I'm honored that you and Torchlight have me. So thank you very much for having me too, and the great work that you guys do all the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Sal, let's start with the obvious. As I mentioned, these are not typical times that we're living in. And we at Torchlight, I just cited a bunch of data from the CDC, but at Torchlight, we know even from our own data that we're tracking that at the start of the pandemic, anxiety, while high to begin with, has become much worse over the past several months. Depression is also on the rise. And, again, all of the other scary things that I mentioned before. As someone who works with youth populations in particular, I would be very curious to find out from you what trends you're noticing in young people this year. And is it any different than before 2020 began?
Well, do you mind if I actually speak a little to a positive? Because I know we're in a very heavy subject.
Oh, please do. Yes.
Great. I would love to. And again, I always say I've been blessed to work with, by and large, the overwhelmingly vast majority of families and kids I've worked with are just really beautiful people and beautiful families. And obviously, mental health things can touch everyone everywhere, even if you're coming from, say, quote unquote, the best of homes. But one of the things, something that sort of emerged out of this, and I'm not saying this is equal across the board, and I'm not saying COVID is a good thing, so I want to make sure I have those disclaimers before I go forward, that what in some way happened is it pulled back the massive glut of overactivity that was sort of squashing our young people, and in some way allowed them to breathe. So some of the things I've heard from parents and kids alike, we have more conversations. We have game nights. We sit down to dinner. And what I've heard from, again, I don't want to oversimplify or take away the tragedy that COVID is, but, hearing from young people calling it a coronacation, which was that they were then removed from the grind of their daily activities. And so, I've joked with people, and obviously it's not just me. There's a ton of people in the mental health field, but I said, in many ways, Corona has done what 20 years of being on the talk circuit could not do. It has removed some of the stressors that were causing the stress. Sorry, go ahead. I feel like you had a question in there.
That's a very interesting point. Thank you for bringing that up. We have talked about that, I think, in other podcasts and webinars at Torchlight. In fact, I think it might have been with you when we did teen stress, just the overscheduling. And that is another observation I think we've all made as well, is it did slow down the pace of life for everybody and kind of allow people to step back, take stock, consider what's really important, and allow people to just be themselves for a while or figure out who they were without all that extra stuff. So I am glad you brought that up. The pandemic in many ways has been a double-edged sword, as things often are in this world, right? Because
exactly, yes.
Every gift comes with challenges and every challenge comes with gifts. So this is one of those moments. We have a lot of challenges before us, but there's always a silver lining also.
If you don't mind, I don't want to blanket sort of the whole young person experience, but if I separated it to pre-18, I would say that some of that has been present, some of those good things. And yet, as you were talking about the CDC numbers, and I've looked at my numbers, sort of that 18 to 34-year-old young adult, I think it may have worked a little bit of the opposite, because some of the isolation that age group was already experiencing seemed to have increased with COVID. So I'm just making up a scenario. You're 23, you're just out of college. Maybe you were already struggling with anxiety, and now you're in a big city and it's your first apartment, and now you're remote and you're already struggling with isolation and anxiety. And now there's a massive pandemic and your people fear for their lives, understandably. And now you feel much more alone. Maybe your work, maybe you got let go, or maybe you're totally working remotely. So your human contact has diminished. And I was seeing that in our young people as a stressor to begin with. As crazy as that might sound, in this world where we seem like we're go, 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 there was a sense of isolation as everyone pursued their own private Idaho. And so, I feel that, for me, it made sense when I saw that the numbers for the suicidal ideation in young adults was really pretty high, and numbers as high as 25%. So, that made sense because of the sort of compounding isolation that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and social isolation can be particularly sharp when there are other significant stressors already, as you mentioned, some maybe having financial concerns or, safety concerns, health concerns, things of that nature. So you pile isolation on top of that, and you've got a potentially serious situation.
Yes. So in our I'd love to report some happy news. And yet there's always, like you had said, there is a trial to the gift, right? On some level, or vice versa.
It's like two sides of a coin, essentially,
yes.
right? You have the pros and the cons, and they're on either side. But so you and I had a nice discussion last week where, you mentioned that in your decades of experience working with teens and supporting them with various mental health challenges, whether that be anxiety or depression or chronic stress, it's nearly always another issue that is lying beneath the surface, gone unaddressed. It's as if we're treating anxiety like it's the problem, when maybe anxiety isn't the sole problem, but instead a symptom of a bigger problem. Can you explain this idea?
Yes, I just am coming from an observational, practical standpoint, right? This is not my thesis statement, so to speak, except that I've been involved in this for so long that in all cases that I have had personally, and that now numbers into the thousands, that I do not have what we might call an idiopathic case of anxiety. I don't have one that there is no known root or no known cause. I don't have what would be called just a generalized anxiety disorder, that everything in sort of my experience with young people has been traceable to an event or multiple events or a way of living that has sort of fostered the behavior, which I would call an anxious behavior or a depressive behavior, is a response to the underlying trauma. That's what I have seen over and over and over. In fact, I've never seen anything else. And given the time, and this is where we run into trouble. And again, I don't want to speak for other people in their lines of work or walk in the mental health field, but we often run into trouble that the whole thing is vacuumized so much that we're not, and mine never was. I was deeply rooted in young people in family lives for over 30 years, in 25 years in one community. So I had the benefit of the softball game, the dinner, the internship, the volunteer experience, the classroom experience over a long period of time. So then things are not vacuumized. It wasn't as if they came into my office in a foreign town for 1 hour a week. And I'm not saying there's value to that experience. I'm not diminishing the value of that experience. I'm just saying that sometimes the difficulty in that is it's harder to get a clearer picture of the person in the environment. And I always fall back to one of the first rules of science, which is just observation. And so for me, the observation of the young person in their environment has proved crucial to what our conversation was last week, which is I do not see this child then as just an anxious child. I see that there have been multitude or one major contributing factors to this. And then I've also had and it's like all professions, it's difficult. So I don't want to say this is foolproof, but I've also had the benefit of seeing a turnaround or seeing people go from that place to a better place, so to speak. And so again, I don't want to jump too far off the subject. To your point, that underlying for me, the root of the anxiety or the depression or a multitude of other things, I would describe those as the behavior, and the underlying condition would be some sort of trauma that either hasn't been recognized or hasn't been unearthed yet.
Yeah. Let's talk about trauma for a minute, because I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's important to discuss what trauma really means. In our conversations together, you've used different terms like trauma, microtrauma, and even stress. How would you define each of those, and how are they different from one another? Because I've been surprised at what actually could classify as trauma.
I'm glad you're bringing that up, Stefanie, because it can be complex, but I use trauma as the umbrella, and then everything sort of falls underneath it. As human beings, what I find is people are good. So when we witness trauma that we recognize, we respond so beautifully to it. if you watch somebody get hit by a car, a multitude of things would happen. But some of the things that would happen is someone would call 911. Someone might go over to comfort the victim. Ambulance would show up. Those people would be well trained to deal. And because we witness it and we know that that is bad and equals trauma. So we know that. We know how to respond. So those would be, when we talk about accidents, loss of life, starvation, war, we just look and say, oh boy, that's bad. So that trauma we recognize very clearly. Underneath that would be what I call microtrauma, and that can be a whole bunch of things. And I want to set this straight first, too. I always say that this is not a new thing. I think that all of a sudden it's come out and it's like that trauma is the new black, right? Or trauma is the
Sure.
is the gluten of this, of this new decade, right? And no, it's been around forever in all these forms. But the ability to then look at it and say, that's going to leave a mark, I think we've gotten better at that. And so one of them, to your point, when you said you're surprised, lack of happy childhood memories is a trauma. Lack of good sleep is a trauma. So it goes into sort of everyone has a bad night's sleep. If you have 17 years of bad night's sleep, well, that's traumatizing.
Yeah.
If your dad yells at you for not putting your bike away and then it rained, I don't know if that's trauma. That's family life. But if your dad yells at you for everything every day for 20 years, that's going to leave a mark. And when people look at those, this is where it gets tricky. When the general public sees this, or even ourselves when we experience it, we can often say to microtraumas, don't be a baby. People have it much worse. All fine, all good rationalizations. Sometimes they work. What happens, nobody is saying anyone's being a baby. No one's saying that we get it. People have it far worse. What happens, though, is sometimes we can ignore the microtraumas till they get too big. And now we're dealing with what I would call, I always say this, microtrauma over a long period of time equals massive trauma. You can only write it off for so long. And I'll say this is not a knock on any office structure or family structure. But if I don't want to pick on poor dad here, but if dad's major way of speaking is always screaming, it then begs the question, why is dad always screaming? And this is having an adverse effect on me. And that's a hard thing to do. I'm just saying that writing it off like everybody's father yells, or everybody's had tough experiences, or people in poor countries are starving to death. You're not. I get all those things. But that still doesn't mean that type of microtrauma persistently will leave an indelible mark that will be hard for the child to overcome because it's never been attended to. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense to me. And what about chronic stress? Can that become trauma? So let me give you an example here. Let's say you have a child, you have one of those overscheduled children that we talked about at the beginning of the episode, right? Someone who's always feeling like they're always stressed because they don't have enough downtime and they can't keep up with their homework. And maybe they have some learning difficulties at school and they don't feel like they can measure up and they're just on the go, and they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. And this is compounded over weeks, months, years, a decade or longer. Is that trauma?
Oh my gosh. And I'm so glad that you bring that up. That may be, in my estimation, the most dastardly form of trauma because there's sort of a machismo, and I mean that both for men and women, around this, which is wink, wink, nod, nod. Some of us can handle it and some of us can't. And that is just not true. I have not seen that. I have seen that people, like me planning a cookout for 100 people might get me all excited and jacked up and ready to go. And for someone else, it causes them a lot of stress. But me taking out the trash might cause me a lot of stress and someone doesn't get it. So it's very particular. And so I always say when some of us are saying some can handle stress, some can't, I always think that, well, most of us can handle certain types and others handle other types better. So on your line, if you don't mind me can I get biological for a moment?
Sure. Yeah.
And this is where it becomes trauma. When we are under stress, we often enact our fight or flight system, which is beautiful. It's designed to save our lives. But getting 3 coffees at a coffee shop is not the same as being attacked by a lion. But if we're igniting the same fight or flight system, your body just sort of recognizes trauma as trauma. So once those dominoes start to fall, so someone gets up, they're like, before I get up, I've got to get out these 47 emails. I've got to cook the kids breakfast. I got to pack lunches. I've got to get the oil changed in the car. I've got to pick up my mother and bring her to the nursing home. And then I have to be at work by 7:15 a.m. That's a heavy load. And to get through that, people have to enact their fight or flight system. So we call that stress. Like, I'm stressed. My day is so busy. I'm stressed. Your body doesn't differentiate. So if the lion comes in the front door and I'm running out the back door, or I'm running out the back door to do those 17,000 tasks before 7:15 when I have to be at work, your body is operating under the same premise that I am in fight or flight mode. And often with regular Americans, we go into the fight mode, that we start powering through all our stuff. No big deal. What happens is your cortisol goes through the roof. It sort of washes over your prefrontal cortex, which makes higher level decisions. And in some way that's good, because what it does, it focuses you. But 2 other things happen. It expands the amygdala, which I loosely call like your anxiety center, and it shrinks your hippocampus, which I, again, loosely call a little bit your happiness center. And this is fine. We're human beings. Your body is designed to do this. But over time, that constant adrenaline rush starts to have deleterious effects on your mind and your body. In some ways, people get caught up in the cycle of not feeling alive unless they feel overly stressed, while that stress starts to have a terrible effect on the body and the mind. And again, one day, 1 week, we all go through it, especially if someone in our family is sick and we're juggling the other kids in our job and we're moving at the same time. Like, we all go through these things. It's when we start to live that way over a long period of time, the body isn't meant to be running from a lion 24/7. And so when we do, all those processes biologically kick into place, and they're not designed to be long-term processes inside the body. They're designed to be there for long-term. They're just not there to be operating on 24/7. And so there's tremendous research about what it does to the brains in young people in terms of their ability to learn and retain knowledge and to make higher level decisions. And Stefanie, do you mind if I share something here?
Please do.
Great, because I'm going to go off on a little tangent. All my work with young people, there has been so much bad press about them, and I have found almost none of it to be true. And one of them is, well, of course they're prone to suicide because, their brains don't get really fully formed till they're 25, so they make rash decisions. I have never really seen that because that ends up categorizing them in the negative. Now, when I put a teenager on a treadmill, and that treadmill started at 8 years old, and I overstressed that young person, now they are overloaded with cortisol, and they have damaged the prefrontal cortex of that young person, disempowering them to make better decisions. Now it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course they make terrible decisions. They're teenagers. And I say that is not true. What we have done is we have so overstressed them that we have damaged their mind, and it's difficult to make the right decision. Given the vast times I've been with young people, the amount of great decisions has so far surpassed the times that they have not made great decisions, because I say this all the time, the human evolution has built their brain to work for their age precisely at this age. It's doing the right thing. It is designed for the age they are. And really, instinctively, I'll say both the amygdala and the hippocampus and all the other brain functions, where they are at that age, are designed to help them make the best decisions. And I, by and large, have found that they do when their brain has not been damaged due to high volumes of stress.
That's so interesting, because what it makes me think of is, well, what you're talking about is taking the onus off of the victim, right? We have that, it's like that victim blaming thing that can happen, right? Where it's not the victim's fault. It's what conditions led up to that in the first place. So I love that reframe that you gave us just now.
Well, thank you. And if you don't mind, I'll segue back just a quick thing. And this is what really has, it's been over the last 20, 25 years. And I'll say flat out where I come from in this. I come from the basic belief, and this is a belief, that the human being is intrinsically made good. I know not everyone comes from that. That's where I come from. So back to our earlier things, when we say to that child, and I have this in therapeutic situations all the time, and I had one yesterday with an older gentleman, and what we end up doing is, before we help them to understand that intrinsic good foundation, we have already labeled them as the anxious child. We have already labeled them as the depressed child. And then we have told them to live into their diagnoses. And I sit there and say, oh, it's like having a broken leg, and you go to school and everyone says, here comes the broken leg kid. We don't do that about you have a broken leg, but we don't categorize you that way. But I feel like this is what we've done in mental health, is we have categorized the young person intrinsically as that. And then we've told them not to buck the system, because the way to get better is to accept that they are that.
Yeah, this is so interesting. So we have a former employee at Torchlight who gave a TED Talk on exactly what you're talking about. And she calls it using people first language. And her frame of reference was substance abuse, but similar to mental health, right? Where in the field of substance abuse, maybe not in the professional field, but in the population, we identify people with the struggle they're having. We call them an addict, or we call them, you know what I'm saying? So instead of we identify them by the illness they're going through. And she makes the same point, that you're right. We don't do this with other physical challenges.
No, we're so good. And again, because my intrinsic belief, people are good. And when we see that broken arm, we understand it. And so we don't do that.
Yeah.
And we struggle on the mental health side right now, and we struggle on the addiction side. And I say we've moved further on the addiction side, which I'm grateful for. And I'm hoping to move there on the mental health side. And again, this is going to sound, let me not judge before I say it, that given the right environment and given the right support, I have seen most human beings normalize into that environment. And I don't like using the word normalize, but for lack of a better one. And I have not seen then those behaviors that they have come forward with, because what has happened in the supportive environment that values and recognizes the intrinsic goodness, and then recognizes giftedness in its varied forms, that person, not just child, but any person, that person starts to get in contact with their own value and giftedness. And then, much like you were saying earlier, they start to move out of a sense of duck and hide, which is part of the fight or flight mechanism, and that would be the hiding part, that they start to move into a greater sense of themselves. And then those other behaviors start to disappear, start to diminish. And I've seen this over and over and over again in a vast multitude of situations that don't just cover young people, but cover all people. And so again, just sharing on the intrinsic value and the idea of not us labeling the child by what we perceive to be their disorder.
Right. And that's a fantastic piece of advice for parents. What else would you say that parents might want to consider in these tough times or others? Because, any time could be considered beautiful or extremely difficult for any number of reasons. What should parents be on the lookout for? How can they help? How can they support their child with these types of struggles?
And again, I said earlier on, I've seen the vast, overwhelming majority of beautiful families who love and care for their kids in enormous ways. And I've seen it now too. And I think a few things, the more that we can stabilize our environment, the stabler and healthier our children can be. And that often requires just us asking ourselves, what do we value? Mm-hmm. And in that process, then building our home life around that. And so, value sleep. So we make that a priority, and we value maybe dinner time, and we make that a priority. And maybe we value a few chores, or maybe we value having fun together. And the more we can attend to those, even in these times, the healthier the whole family unit is. And that's that becomes a really big thing. We can't always control everything around us, but we do have some control around our environment. And when we can attend to it in a really positive way, it has really positive outcomes on our kids. And the second one I've seen over and over, and I think this is really beautiful, is the check-in with the child, which is, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And I know for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable ground to talk about feelings. And I'm not always saying that it has to be done all the time, but the idea that we're opening the conversation, the idea that there's a free flow of feelings in a home, in a way to talk about how you feel, really ends up bringing so much healing to any situation. We might not, we could have a child who says, I'm really nervous about COVID. Okay. I can't solve that COVID is here, but I've seen this so much that the child being able to share that and not be ashamed of sharing that actually brings some measure of healing, because there's some measure of solidarity that somebody is walking with you in the difficulty of your own feelings, not dismissing them. So I'll just say, if I'm a dad and I say to my son, hey, Jack, how you feeling? He goes, I'm really bummed out that I lost all this stuff senior year. I didn't have my prom. I didn't have lacrosse. We didn't have graduation party. Just me asking. And then I can say, similarly, I'm really sorry. That must be really hard. I'm not sorry. I didn't cause it, but identifying. And I found so often that so when parents are just willing to walk the journey, we don't always have to have all the answers, but if we open the conversation and we're in solidarity and we validate that what they tell us is real and that they are struggling, and we allow that, then I find that a lot of healing just takes place with that.
Yeah. And like you said, not dismissing their concerns as not being bad enough, right? So when you're just wanting a shoulder to cry on, you don't want to hear, well, there are so many people who have it so much worse than you. And to basically say, you don't have the right to be sad about anything ever, And I think that's a dangerous place to be. What I find happens is that if you offer that and say, yeah, you know what, that's really hard. That must have been really terrible for you. Whatever you're going to say, and you sympathize with someone, then it's very common that they come to that conclusion on their own. Once they've had that validation that, yes, it really was hard. Thank you for saying that. That really was hard. And then they can go on to say, well, it's like a self-healing activity that people do where they say, well, thank you for listening. And then they realize, but you know what? Then they put it into perspective. You know what I'm saying? And then they say, well, I really don't have it that hard compared to some. It could be a lot worse. I'm going to be in gratitude for what I do have. People will come to that on their own, usually if they have the support from the people around them.
Absolutely.
But you can't rush that step. You can't rush them to that step.
No, you can't, right? And sadly, right, it's not my step to put them on, right? Like that, and I don't mean sadly, I mean that in a good way, I should say, that it's their step to go when they're ready to go to that step. And when someone tells us something hard, the identification becomes the big thing. And again, just being there in solidarity and allowing that voice to share that experience. And again, it also goes back to what you talked about stress earlier. For some people, walking into a dark room is stressful. And for some people, heights are stressful, and everyone has their triggers or their tics, and that often just the expression of it allows for some measure of healing. Or to your point, I thought that was really beautiful, that you can come to some sort of validation or rationalization on your own. Like, maybe I don't have it so bad. And that's a really beautiful place for the person who's struggling. And that person who's struggling tends to be all of us at some point.
Yeah.
You know? And I will say this, right? We won't know. And this is not, I'm not trying to paint a dark picture, but we don't know what the long-term effects of COVID will be. And like you had so beautifully said in the beginning, there's two sides to every coin. There'll be some difficult things and there'll be some gifts that come out of this period of time. And we'll see over a long period of time what it has meant for our children. And I don't know what that'll be, but I do know the more that we can balance our environments and continue to put the things in there that we know are healthy, and the more that we can continue to help facilitate the conversation and validate the feelings or the struggle, then I know those things always have tremendous positive long-term effects. Always. It's almost like they're foolproof.
Yeah, absolutely.
Though
Absolutely.
Nothing is foolproof, but they are really, really, really good.
Super helpful. Yeah, absolutely. Those are great tips and suggestions, wonderful insight. I would also just encourage anyone out there listening who is struggling with anxiety or depression, or someone, their child or someone close to them is, and you're trying all this stuff and you're not getting anywhere. Don't hesitate to reach out to a mental health practitioner or your physician and seek help if and when you need it. I'm sure you would agree.
Yeah, oh my gosh, absolutely. And finding somebody, right, who does listen and validate your struggle and is in your corner is really, really important. I totally agree with you. Are we running out of time? Do we have a couple more seconds? Because I just segueing back to something else. I meant to mention this when we were under the umbrella of trauma and we talked about trauma and microtrauma and stress. What has happened over this past generation, I'll throw COVID into this now too, is there is the scientific thought out there of complex trauma. And that is when you have a multitude of what I'd call sort of microtraumas happening simultaneously.
Interesting.
Right. And so, if you're not getting good sleep and you're not getting proper nutrition and your workplace is very stressful and I'm at it with my wife all the time and my mom's in the hospital, like now you have, and this happens for a long period of time, now you have a complex trauma situation. So when I talk about young people and tracing it back, what has been a challenge has been when you're coming into your conscious mind, into your teenage years, and you're feeling depressed or anxious, often it's because there's been a pattern of complex trauma. And not one in and of itself has been abusive or intended or bad, but just a multitude of things together that then create this, what we might call generalized anxiety disorder or depression or whatever else. And often I've seen that to be the case, that it's been a bunch of things, almost like the perfect storm. Mm-hmm. And so as we move into, in this period of COVID, I'm not saying it is for everyone, but it can be just one more thing of worry and concern and disruption to life. And for a lot of our kids, there has been some tremendous loss and things that are not repeatable. And I'm not saying every child will feel awful about them, so I don't want to put that on all kids. But the idea that I did lose my senior prom and I did lose my senior banquet and I did lose my senior baseball season, and I did lose my graduation. Those are significant moments in someone's life. And they are built into our structure, like Christmas and Halloween and Thanksgiving. They're built in and they don't repeat every year. I just throw that in there, that as we all sort of try to walk a little gently on this ground because everyone is sort of enduring something very challenging. But our kids certainly are, even if they don't show it sometimes, that there's a lot in here. And so again, just the check-in, I just wanted to connect that with sort of complex trauma a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very interesting. Great food for thought. Well, Sal, thank you so much for being here today. It's always such a pleasure talking to you, and I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective. It feels very healing to me, and I hope
good.
Yeah, it really always is, and I hope it's been equally helpful for our listeners as well. If you are listening and you'd like to know more about some of these topics, and you have a Torchlight account, I suggest you log in and access the e-guide called "Helping Your Child Manage the Difficult Events of 2020, and also explore a number of helpful guides about anxiety and depression in children and teens. That is all we have for you today. Thank you all so much for listening. Please be well, be gentle with yourselves. What we're experiencing isn't easy, so be sure to give yourselves the care that you need to stay healthy and balanced. We will see you next time.
Thank you, Stefanie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. Find this and other episodes on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Child or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.